All right, welcome to Newman Portal on Saturday afternoon, Newman Portal Symposium. We have Heath MacAlpine is going to be presenting on United States Mint medals of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which is a surprisingly rich series, as you will hear. We will take Q&A at the end. Enter them into the Q&A at the bottom of your viewer. If you don't see it, you can hover over it with your mouse and it'll pop up. With that, I'll turn it over to Heath.
Well, thanks so much, and thanks to everybody out there who's tuned in for this presentation today. I'm a great admirer of historic leaders, and Roosevelt is certainly, in terms of the United States, one of the big ones, and in terms of how he impacted our country. And his time in office and his legacy, I think, is reflected in the mint medals that were produced during his tenure in office, and they show, I think, a strong tendency, his strong tendency towards leadership, and they show the change in time from the focus on the New Deal and coming out of the Depression to a World War II sort of focus. So why don't we go ahead and get underway. Thank you first to the Metal Collectors of America for their support of metal collectors like myself. I do want to thank the late Joe Levine from Presidential Coin and Antiques Company, no longer in business, and he's no longer with us, but he was such a critical player in the research of United States mint medals. There's so much to find in his old catalogs that you'll not find anywhere else. And finally, a thank you to the Numismatic Portal for bringing all these various sources together in one place and making it so much easier to do the research that needs to be done on these topics. So thank you. FDR, champion of hope and war leader. He was our 32nd president of the United States, born into a privileged family in Hyde Park, New York in 1882. He grew up, went to Harvard, and like his distant cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, went into the Department of Navy as the assistant secretary during the Wilson administration during World War I. After that, he ran as vice presidential candidate with James Cox. I put in a plug for James Cox here. I'm a Daytonian, and Cox published our Dayton Daily News here in town. Ran with him and got thrashed by the ticket of Harding and Coolidge that year. Within a year or two of that, Roosevelt fell ill with what was thought at the time as being infantile paralysis. May have been something else, but the net effect was the same. He lost the use of his legs and spent the rest of his life either in braces, being supported by other strong arms around him, or in a wheelchair. His political career was largely over at that point, but he resurrected it as the country headed into the Depression and was elected governor of New York in 1930. In 1932, he ran for the presidency and won the first of 4 terms.
Franklin Roosevelt steps into the worst economic crisis in the history of the world when he's president. So he's a man who's got a lot of challenges.
The nation was in trouble. The danger was not just that capitalism would fail, but if capitalism failed, it would bring down representative democracy with it.
His first contribution was to say, I have a plan to fix this. And his New Deal legislation helped create economic stability and lay the foundation for an economic renaissance that continued for decades and decades after he left office.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
The second great crisis that Roosevelt faces is World War II. He realizes very early on that the U.S. will get involved in this war. And so the question for him is, how does he get the American people on board?
What made Franklin Roosevelt a great leader was his visionary ability to make the case for his ideas.
I want to talk with you about a number of subjects that directly affect the future of the United States.
President Roosevelt came in at the right time to take advantage of this new technology called radio that could broadcast his voice all over the country, and was able to use that tool to win over voters.
I think it's very difficult to identify one leadership quality that's responsible for his success. But I think that I would point to his ability to rely on others. He has the wisdom and confidence to know he needs a brain's trust, that he can't solve all the problems of the Depression on his own.
He looked all over the country, and he brought to Washington the smartest people he could find.
When we think about what kind of person Franklin Roosevelt is, I think one of the things that strikes me most is the stretch that he had to make to go from being a wealthy patrician American to being this man who understood the poorest, most dejected American worker on the street. And to have them think, to believe that he understands them.
Franklin Roosevelt bequeathed to the working people of this nation, to the poor, to people of color, to immigrants, a sense that the government was theirs, and the government was going to look after them and do the best for them.
I think video like that helps you give a little context. I was born about 15 years after FDR died, but even then, his shadow in American politics over the next few decades was strong. We've come a few decades since then, so I think it helps to, particularly with some of our younger attendees, to maybe give them a basis to understand a little bit about the man. Nellie Tayloe Ross is also an important player in the story of these medals. She was the first female governor in the United States and the longest serving director of the United States Mint, as well as the first female director. Nellie was born in Missouri, grew up in Kansas and Nebraska. In 1902, she met William Ross, who was an attorney out of Tennessee. They got married and they relocated to Cheyenne, Wyoming, where William went into business and hung out a shingle. He was politically active in the Democratic Party, running unsuccessfully for some offices while serving as prosecutor. In 1922, though, he was successful and was elected governor of the state. His administration did not last long, however. The following year, in 1924, following a speech and on his way home, he fell ill. It turned out to be appendicitis. He underwent an operation, but unfortunately, he died and left his family behind, the three boys and Nellie. Nellie, however, was not left alone. The Democratic Party came and said, look, we're going to have a special election. We'd like you to run. You were intimately connected with your husband's administration. Would like you to take his place as governor. So she ran in the special election in 1924, and she won. And she became the first woman to hold the office in the United States. She had a successful gubernatorial tenure, did well with it, but had to face re-election in 1926 when the term was up. Ran again. This time, though, she lost narrowly to the Republican challenger. Much of the thought is because she was an ardent dry, that's prohibition speak for somebody who was against selling booze. She lost some votes in that in Wyoming and lost the job. However, she was quite popular with Democrats across the country and was tapped to play a major role in the 1932 campaign for FDR. In fact, she was put in charge of outreach to women across the country and opened the campaign for the Roosevelt administration in September of that year. Here's a picture of her as that campaign gets underway. She was successful in playing her role in getting FDR elected in a landslide election. And as a result, she was one of three women, the others two being Frances Perkins, who had worked with FDR in New York, and Ruth Bryan Owens, a congresswoman from Florida, and the daughter of William Jennings Bryan, the three-time presidential candidate. She was one of those three who were mentioned as a possible cabinet post appointee and would have been the first woman in the cabinet in American history. You should note, though, that when it was talked about in the papers, it was talked about one of these three because they seemed to have a limit. They would only let one woman in the cabinet at that point. And that job went to Frances Perkins, who became Secretary of Labor in the first Roosevelt administration. Ruth Owens ended up becoming our first female ambassador and went to be ambassador to Denmark. And Nellie Tayloe Ross was offered and accepted the job as director of the United States Mint, based in Washington, overseeing the Mint and the various other functions of the United States Mint, and took that role in 1933. Here's a little bit of video with Nellie, just as she's getting started and her job in the Mint.
That while directing the coinage of money, that I had some magical power by which I could direct the flow of it into channels of trade far and wide. Our hope, however, of revival of business and the revival of our happiness lies in the broad, heroic policies that President Roosevelt is sponsoring and that happily are now fast being converted into governmental action.
And the third person in this discussion is John Ray Sinnock, who is the chief engraver of the United States Mint. He was born in New Mexico in 1888, studied art in Philadelphia, and was an assistant chief engraver for a while under George Morgan in the 19-teens. He left that job and became a teacher in the same art institute that he had been taught in. After Morgan's death in 1925, Sinnock was called upon to accept the role of chief engraver and come back to the Mint. He is a little enigmatic. There's not a lot of information on John. In fact, this profile picture is typical of the pictures I've been able to find of them. They all seem to have him looking at a die or engraving a plaster. Very few pictures of it where you can see the front of his face, and not a ton of information. He seems to have been a rather solitary individual. He was married, but he was long separated from his wife and lived a bachelor's existence in Philadelphia, lived about 4 blocks away from the Mint. Let's talk a little bit now about the medals themselves. We're going to start with the list medals issued under FDR's tenure. We're not talking about these. These are the inaugural medals. For those of you who don't know the difference, the inaugural medals are typically issued by the Presidential Inaugural Committee as a fundraiser in the modern era. FDR obviously had 4 of them for each of his terms. Some were struck at the Mint, some were struck at other companies like the Medallic Art Company. None of these portraits were designed by Sinnock, although the third inaugural medal for Roosevelt, the one in the lower left, the reverse of it was a reworked William or Charles Barber design from the 1800s that Sinnock pulled out, I think, because time was short, and updated it slightly. I'm going to leave that, though, in the inaugural series, and there are a lot of experts on that. You can take a look at what they've produced. It's called a list medal because it was sold off of a list. The United States Mint began in the 1860s issuing periodic lists of medals that they had available, and this is the one that is contemporaneous with the Roosevelt administration. This is the 1936 list. And you'll see in this blow up that the Franklin Roosevelt medal is number 31 on the list, and you could buy it for a cool $1 bill from the Mint. It shows that over on the right-hand side, Sinnock is given credit for it. 48 shows how big it is. It is 48/16 of an inch wide, 3 inches. I don't know why we have to make life so complicated. If you wanted to buy that medal today, it is available from the Mint, although the price has gone up slightly from the $1 in 1936. It'll set you back a sharp $100. A little bit excessive. Nobody asked me how to price these things. So let's start looking at the medals. This is a pattern that Sinnock did in 1933 after Roosevelt was sworn in March of that year. I haven't blown it up, but under the bust is a Sinnock signature and a little bit of Latin that roughly translates out to sculpted or drawn from life. This metal did not, the obverse of it though, did not make it into production. The reverse did, with the eagle and the fasces and the shield and the text about the inauguration. I suspect the reason it didn't make it is because the metal that did show some differences. This is the actual, now I'll get into those in a moment, but this is the actual metal. The signature under the bust is a little bit different, says the same things as the earlier one, except now it's dated 1934. This is interesting insofar as the reverse of this metal, I think, is kind of, it's got this soft Art Deco look to it, slightly melted. The field is very smooth. There's no texture to it. The obverse shows a pretty standard portrait by Sinnock of that era. When you look at what he's done for various secretaries of state, secretaries of the Treasury, mint directors, the presidents, he did a Coolidge and Hoover medal. The profile on this is in line with it. It is different from the pattern. I think the major difference is the haircut and the fact that you can actually see the president's cheekbones and jawbones a little bit. He looks a little fat in the pattern. I suggest that the president and his wife took a look at that and said, that's not going to cut it. Let's go back and try again. So they came up with the second one. So again, I would call this the first term medal with the first obverse, 1934, and the first reverse. This is the first one that actually went into production for sale. And there's a blow up of Sinnock's signature, J.R. Sinnock, made from life, and then the date in Roman numerals, 1934. This medal was widely promoted when it was issued. There was an AP story that went out to newspapers across the country. If you look at newspapers that era, this story is all over there, and it shows Sinnock again in profile working on the plaster of the medal and the medal itself down at the bottom. It does reference that there were 500 that would be struck off, but after that, they would be made for public sale. And same medal, same time, slightly different portrait of Sinnock, again, a profile of the man as he's working on the medal. Apparently, that language about 500 being struck off was changed in some of the news reports to 500 medals that'll be given away to the top men of the government. This is an article that came out of the numismatist. Nellie Taylor Ross was not happy with that. I think she was sensitive to the fact that if the government is giving things away, that means the government is being wasteful. And she did not want that to be said about her mint. So she said that was not possible. Even the president couldn't have it unless he paid $1. And that goes on to say that he didn't have to pay $1, as a matter of fact, because Nellie Taylor Ross went ahead and paid it for him and gave him the medal. Very good political sense as Nellie Taylor Ross. This is almost the same medal, but it's a little different. You'll see on the portrait to the left, just over the shoulder, is a small copyright symbol. This is unlike the first medal, which lacked it. And this is really, with John Sinnock, the only mint artist sculptor that I've seen who has copyrights on some of his productions for the mint. It mystifies me a little bit, because if the mint paid for him to do the work, I would think that the mint would own the copyright. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But this is peculiar to this series of medals. You will find the Roosevelt medals with and without the copyright symbol. So some dies had it, some did not. This again is the first term medal with the first obverse and the first reverse with the copyright on it. And there's the copyright symbol blown up in case you missed it. So even though this took 2 tries to get that portrait, apparently that wasn't enough. In 1935, Sinnock prepared this pattern of a different profile for the medal. This one did not go into production, but one very similar to it did. This is the second obverse of the Roosevelt medal series. You can see that the head is similar, although I would suggest on the one that went into production, the detail overall is a little sharper, but the shoulders are included in this. So I think it is a bit more balanced. The first one, the head is so large as to almost overwhelm the medal. I would also maybe point out, if you look at the Roosevelt medal, you'll see that texturing over both of his shoulders on the right and the left. I think that suggests the sea, the water. Roosevelt was always fascinated with the United States Navy, having served as the assistant secretary. He was quite a sportsman on the water himself, had several sailboats that he sailed on a regular basis before he became ill. So this is, in my mind, this is what Sinnock was trying to portray, a very vibrant portrait of the man with the ocean behind him. And this is the second medal then issued in the Roosevelt series. Again, we're still in the first term. This is the second obverse, about 1935 or 1936. This particular one has a copyright on it, some don't. And we have the same reverse as we did on the first medal. So this is number 2 of the first term. Wait, there's more. Again, here's the copyright on that medal and the JRS monogram. Here is the first term medal, second obverse that we previously saw, but now a new, slightly new reverse. Rather than having that slight melted chocolate look that the first one had, this one is a bit more realistic. The smooth surface has been replaced with a lot of hatching and shading in the lower part of the medal, and we have a whole series of rays emanating from the fasces behind the eagle that we lacked on the preceding one. The eagle itself is much sharper in detail, not quite as Art Deco looking, and the inscription has been changed. Instead of saying inaugurated March 4th, 1933, it now says inaugurated President 1933. So within his very first term, FDR has 3 different collectible medals. Of those 3, the very first one is by far the easiest to find. It's not common, but it's easier to find. It was sold in fairly large numbers at the time, I think. I don't think the following ones were, and I think a large part of it had to do with the Depression. Even then, $1 was a big chunk of money, and if you had bought the very first one, as most people did, I think, you might not have been tempted to go back if you even knew that these other 2 medals were issued. I suspect the Mint changed the design and just put these into production without making a big say about it. He was reelected by another landslide in 1936, defeating Alf Landon, governor of Kansas, in that election. And there were some pretty significant changes to the reverse of this medal. The obverse remains the same and will throughout the rest of the series, but the reverse saw some pretty significant alterations. First, the fasces that the eagle had been perched on and the shield above the fasces are now gone, replaced by this cartouche with the inaugurated president language on it and a garland hanging from either side. I suspect that's because by the time you get to 1936, Mussolini, leader of the fascist party in Italy, had been in power for some 14 years. Adolf Hitler had come to power under the Nazis in Germany in 1933, almost contemporaneous with Roosevelt being sworn in the United States. And I think the fasces had lost a lot of its appeal by that point. So I'm not surprised that they switched over to this design. It now has his 2 inaugural dates on it, March 4th, 1933 and January 20th, 1937. Again, you'll find these with and without the copyright symbol on it. Roosevelt made presidential history in 1940, defeating Wendell Willkie of Indiana for an unprecedented 3rd term in office. The obverse remains the same. The reverse remains the same overall, but you notice the dates have changed. Instead of spelling out March in January, Sinnock has now abbreviated that because he's running out of room. So it now says MAR period 4th, 1933, and the same with the January dates in 1941. This one and the preceding one, let's go back to that real quick, the 2nd term medal, these are thought to be some of the hardest and rarest to find, again, for the same reason that I cited on those 1st term medals. The 2nd term medal in particular seems to be quite rare. And finally, FDR was elected to his 4th and final term in 1944, defeating Thomas Dewey of New York. And Sinnock got the old medal out and dusted off the design and shrunk the font that the dates were sculpted in so he could get a 4th date on it. And this is the medal that was produced. This medal actually remained in production beyond FDR's date in 1945 and was struck all the way into the 1970s. It was removed from the presidential series and replaced with a memorial medal, but it was still available for the mint. You could buy this at the time. So this one is available. You can find it with not too much trouble. It is much more expensive than the memorial medal, but it is much more common than the other ones in the presidential series.
Women control the nation's purse strings, so it is fitting that the making of coins is under the supervision of a woman. Mrs. Nellie Tayloe Ross is director of the Mint and custodian of our vast gold and silver store. Next time you reach into your pocket for nickel to make a phone call, stop a moment to think of the hours of work that went to produce that single coin. Various designs were submitted, one finally approved and sent to the engraving department of the Mint. Here, an artist is putting the lettering and finishing touches on the original clay model of a medal bearing the likeness of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. From the clay, a plaster model is molded and finished by hand. And in turn, this is used to make a hard metal form from which the finished medal is reproduced in bronze. A transfer engraving machine reduces the original to a small die from which commemorative medals can be struck off. Beginning with George Washington, it has been the custom of the Mint to strike off medals bearing the likenesses of our presidents. And these handsome medallions may be purchased from the Philadelphia Mint.
How incredibly lucky to find that bit of film from the late 1940s. That, in fact, the artist was, in fact, John Sinnock, working on a plaster of the medals we've been talking about today. The guy that you saw sitting in front of him, I believe, was Adam Pites, the assistant chief engraver who worked with him on a number of these medals over the years. That was an incredible thing to see the actual man doing it. And again, it was in profile, wasn't it? The next series of medals we want to talk about with Roosevelt portrait was the Assay Commission medals, issued annually pretty much from the 1870s through about 1977, and given to the Assay Commission members in Washington when they came to check out our silver and gold and how well the mint was doing. There were 4 of them in this series that portray Roosevelt. The first is the Assay Medal of 1935 by Sinnock. It uses that first approved portrait from the first term series, again showing the 1934 date underneath. The reverse is interesting. The female figure sitting in front of the scale with the coining press behind her is taken by many people to be Nellie Tayloe Ross herself, sculpted by Sinnock and used on the reverse of this medal. She must have liked it because this reverse was used on her Mint Director's medal when that was produced slightly later on. I think Nellie did a particularly good job of making sure the president understood what a good job the Mint was doing and doing for him while he was president, and in turn, Ross must have been honored by Sinnock, who realized it was good to be in with the boss, put her on the medal. Roosevelt showed up again in the 1936 medal. The obverse is by Sinnock, James Sinnock, and the reverse is by Du Vivier, the French sculptor. Actually, the bust of Washington is by the sculpture of the inscription, and the rest were probably done by the Mint in the early 1900s. So again, this is a reproduction of his approved second bust of Roosevelt. It is trimmed a little bit underneath the shoulder. It's a smaller medal, so they tried to, I think, pull in the design a little bit. Here's the third in the series, 1940, honoring Roosevelt. Again, the same portrait on the obverse. The reverse shows the original Mint buildings, or at least the artist's conception of those buildings. I suspect the reverse, since it has both Sinnock's name on it and the assistant engraver's Pites' name on it, the Sinnock probably did the lettering on that, and Pites did the actual building in the center. It looks like his work. And the final Mint medal, the Assay series, Roosevelt 42, two-headed and with and Washington. A little bit different. The portraits are pulled into sort of a porthole display, and but otherwise are very similar to the earlier medal. That's the last of the Assay medals. My understanding is that the last three of these in particular are tough to find. Assay medals have a constituency all of their own. They are vigorously collected by a smaller group of people out there who were willing to spend the money to get these things. So the later ones have been harder to find, I suspect, because as you go further along, the likelier it is that some of the recipients or their immediate descendants are still holding onto these medals. So those were expensive medals given to the elite of mint circles, the people on the Assay Commission. What about the regular Joe Blow who showed up at the mint in that era and they went on a tour and they wanted a souvenir? Well, what would they get? Well, beginning in the 1920s, the mint struck souvenir medals showing the president on the obverse and a reverse indicative of the mint. Initially, it showed an eagle, spread-winged, very Morganish, in fact, done by George Morgan on the reverse. But starting in 1931, Adam Peitz's reverse showing the mint facade was used. These were sold to people who came to the mint for a quarter each, and you could buy them, and people did. They took them home as souvenirs. Because they were bought by the general public, they weren't always given the tender, loving care a numismatist might. I have this medal displayed because I think this is typical of what happened to a lot of them. It had a hole punched in the top of Roosevelt's head, probably to hang on a ribbon, probably as a decoration, perhaps for a campaign. I have a much nicer one, but this one I think is more evocative of the whole tourist experience. These were not issued every year. They were issued apparently as needed. This is the 1934 version. In 1936, another one came out with the second approved portrait of Roosevelt on the obverse. And over the next few years, there was a little change. There was one in 1936 that is somewhat easy to find. 1937, that is for some reason hard to find. And 1938, somewhat easier to find. This is a little bit different in that this does have the copyright on it. This was the only one of the mint visit medals with Roosevelt that had the copyright on it that I knew of until a couple of weeks ago when I found another one on another medal. I'll add that to the presentation sometime in the future. And after 1938, there were no more dated ones. One was issued without the date, and this was struck and available from the mint all the way up to the 1960s and perhaps the early 1970s. So a mint visitor or somebody ordering by mail could have received one of these for a very nominal price. There's about 17 medals, main medals in this series, perhaps 18 or 19 overall if you're interested in collecting them. I've had a lot of fun doing so. And the final mint medal that I want to talk about today is the Memorial Medal. This sculpture is from the FDR Memorial in Washington, D.C. FDR lived almost to the end of the Allied victory in Europe in 1945, dying in Warm Springs on April the 12th, 1945, the New York Times, with the president's portrait in black. Many people could not imagine Roosevelt dying. He had been president for so long, and particularly for our soldiers and our sailors and our airmen overseas. For most of them, he had been the only president they really remembered. So to lose him like this at that moment was the height of sadness, I think, for the country. And I've always found this little clip to be particularly moving. The papers published casualty lists as the war went on. So if somebody in your community died, you'd likely see their name there. And this is the Army-Navy casualty list for April 13th, 1945, and it lists Army-Navy dead. Roosevelt Franklin D., Commander-in-Chief, wife, Mrs. Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, the White House. Sinnock got to work, and he sculpted a new reverse and put that, the mint got to work producing that medal. It was very popular. In fact, this is the most popular and most widely produced and most widely available Roosevelt medal in the mint series. In fact, if you order a medal today, this is the medal you will receive. It shows the president's second portrait on the obverse, on the reverse, a female figure, I think reflecting Columbia, holding a garland as a sailing ship sails out of sight on the left, and on the right, it shows a field of crosses, as in a military graveyard. And at the top, it says, "For country and humanity." There's a better shot of that particular medal. This is one that was made in 1946. The reverse remains the same, and you can see that, the obverse remains the same, and you can see that reverse I talked about. Very softly sculpted. In fact, it's hard to make out the sailing ship on the left, and the crosses on the right are very, very soft. This is the same medal, more recent production. I bought this from the Mint 2018. The details have been sharpened up considerably over the years. The Mint produced other small souvenir medals at that time. These are not very widely known. This is one that was produced sometime between 1945 and, again, I would think the early 1960s. I want to differentiate these from later metallic Roosevelt medals of this small size. You'll see there is no rim around it. This is like a medal. There is no rim as you'd find on the coins. In 1971, Mint Director Mary Brooks introduced a series of small presidential medals for collectors, specifically for young people to collect, stretching from George Washington all the way to, at that time, Richard Nixon. This is the Roosevelt version, shows the memorial medal. You'll see that rim going around it. The medal as a whole has a very coinish feeling to it. I think it was struck one time by the press, just like a coin, one and done. And even at this point, it was still had a copyright symbol on it and the initials. This one is the only one not struck in Philadelphia. This particular one was struck at the Denver Mint. This is the same medal, a later version of it. JRS's initials are still on it, but the copyright is gone. There had been a copyright on the reverse over Sinnock's name. That is gone at this point as well. The Mint issued this one more time in 2014. And this is a very matte finish version of the medal that was available in the Roosevelt coin and currency set. Very sharp, and is actually the easiest to see the design, particularly by the way the patina was applied to this medal. And this is the most recent of that series, a 1 ounce silver piece that was in the same coin and currency set. The Mint's currently reproducing all the presidential medals in silver, one at a time, and going through the whole series. They'll eventually catch up to the Roosevelt medal, and this will be issued at that time again. The final bit I want to talk about deals with the copyrights. A guy named Jennings Hood and side gigs, work on the side. John Sinnock was no different than many of our other engravers. He turned in his the work he owed the Mint and took care of business there. But he also, in his spare time, was a well-known sculptor and medalist in his own right, and would entertain private commissions. And many of his medals were issued by outfits like the Medallic Art Company out of New York and other prominent medallic production firms. Jennings Hood was a Philadelphia jeweler. He specialized in trophies, in class rings, in other things having to do with fraternities, anything that seemed to have a metallic side to it. And his office was only less than a mile's walk from the Mint. This gets into a little bit about why we have the copyrights and what I think was going on with these. Here's an ad from Jennings Hood, again, talking a little bit about his line of work. This is from the 19-teens, and he describes himself as a jeweler, a medalist, and a stationer, and would offer you loving cups or medals or whatever you needed. This is a pretty common bit of exonumia, a medal from the campaign of 1932. It's called a lucky tillicum. A tillicum is a Northwest indigenous people's word that apparently means people. So it basically says lucky people 1932. It's got a Roosevelt portrait on the obverse, much different than the ones we've seen at the Sinnock medals. And the inscription lucky tillicum, excuse me, rebuild with Roosevelt. And on the reverse, a map of the United States with the sun rising above it, the date 1933, and the inscription "Prosperity, follow the Roosevelt Trail," and the copyright symbol on the obverse. This is interesting. I think this is actually a Sinnock piece, and I think the portrait was by John Sinnock. Here's a little bit about it from the numismatist in that era that discusses the medal, attributes it to the Patriotic Products Association at the southeast corner of Chestnut and 13th Streets in Philly, which is where Jennings Hood's storefront, his office was. And it describes the medal a little bit and the medals that it was struck in, and the fact that one has been given to Governor Roosevelt in gold. So here's the reason I think it's by Sinnock. This is where the copyright stuff gets interesting. This is from the Copyright Index put out by the United States government, big books that have now been digitized, so you can look this up online. But this talks about a copyright taken out by the Patriotic Products Association in Philly and attributed to Sinnock. And it talks about a lucky nickel. And these pieces were about the size of a nickel, bearing the legend Tillicum and the head of a buffalo on the obverse. The map, USA, and outlined rising sun with the year 1932 with the rays pointing to prosperity. So the description here, particularly of the reverse, is very much like the Lucky Tillicum medal we just looked at a second ago. Not exactly, but you can see where if Jennings Hood wanted to start producing them, well, Sinnock said, I have a design that we can adapt to this. As far as the obverse is concerned, here is a separate copyright assignation to Sinnock from 1933. So it is contemporary with the Lucky Tillicum. It is not the first term pattern medal, because I doubt he would have copyrighted something that was not going to actually go into production. And it's too early for the later second approved portrait. So I would suggest that this is actually a John Sinnock product made in conjunction with Jennings Hood and this Patriotic Products Association. And I assume he was doing it because there was a business relationship with Jennings Hood. Sinnock produced the designs, Hood produced the medal, and the money was divvied up. Again, here is a later copyright notice. This, I suspect, is for the second medal, second portrait of Roosevelt. It's dated late 1935, so that would fall in with that. Some other things that might have been produced by Jennings Hood. First, some pinbacks. There are a series of small dime-sized medals like this that were made available at that time. And the inscriptions are slightly different. Some of them say the same as the FDR second portrait medals, the same inscription. Some say "Forward with Roosevelt," which would be a 1936 re-election sort of slogan. And this one says "For Defense for President." So this is 1940 as we're getting close to entry into World War II. Again, this is an example of what a private jeweler or private minter would produce using Sinnock's design, still under copyright on this. And there are two more interesting medals in this series, again produced by Jennings Hood, that uses the second approved Roosevelt portrait on the obverse. On the reverse, a separate design, not by Sinnock, I think, but showing the United States Capitol and has his re-election date in 1936 and his inauguration date in 1937, and the wording over the Capitol, "Prosperity Token." And then it says Jennings Hood and the copyright over on the side. So this is with the 1937 inauguration. And again, here's something from the numismatist talking about this, talking about Jennings Hood having brought this out, referencing back to the Lucky Tillicum from several years earlier, and saying that this was available for a not too hateful 10 cents each in nickel or in nickel silver or in bronze. And here is the copyright that Jennings Hood took, and a guy named Herman Frank, who's apparently the sculptor. I have not researched Mr. Frank. If any of you want to do it, feel free. I'd be interested in knowing a little bit more about him. But his reverse was coupled with Sinnock's obverse. And this is the final medal in that series, 1941 inauguration. Exactly the same as the previous one, except instead of saying "Prosperity Token," it now shows Chief of National So again, this on the Roosevelt New Deal and economic recovery to getting prepared to the very likely entry of the country into World War II. And the last copyright thing, Sinnock copyrighted the medal in the memorial medal in 1945. And just for giggles a little bit, I found this. I don't know who made this. It isn't anybody I know, and it certainly isn't a Sinnock portrait, but it's one that copies the Sinnock portrait. So pervasive has that become within medallic circles in terms of portraiture of FDR that it's even stolen by people and used on other things. This is a silver dollar-sized nickel medal that somebody produced at some point. So just to sum up a little bit about this, I think with the Roosevelt administration medals, we see several things in play. We see, as I've previously discussed, the country as it gets into the Depression and starts to deal with those issues, and then the switch as we see the challenge that is facing us in this monumental catastrophe that is called World War II as it looms on the horizon. We see a Mint director, Nellie Tayloe Ross, who is very sensitive to the fact that she is the first female director and very sensitive to the fact that she needs to be supporting the president who appointed her. Nellie Tayloe Ross would continue in the Mint director's seat long after FDR's death, serving until 1953 for 20 years as Mint director. She is probably the longest serving of the original New Dealers. I doubt anybody else was still in government by the time she was retired right before, after Eisenhower came in. Ross lived in the Washington, D.C. area for the rest of her life, dying at the age of 101 in 1977. She's buried with her husband out in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Sinnock did not outlive the memorial reverse himself too long. He died in 1947. Again, a fairly solitary figure. Be interested in seeing more information about him. I understand that Barbara Gregory, the former editor of the Numismatist, is working on such a book that should be extremely interesting to read when that comes out. Clearly, FDR is one of our big three presidents, along with Washington and Lincoln. He is the outstanding president of the 20th century and has been the most consequential in many, many ways. Even today, we still are enjoying the benefits of his vision in terms of a collective defense. The NATO alliance is a child of the alliances that he was putting in place during World War II. And we see even on the social programs like the Social Security Act and the Social Security Administration, the good that those continue to do in our country. In terms of what other people think of him, I'll leave you with this, the following clip. This is a clip prepared by Professor Walter Lantz showing Oswald the Lucky Rabbit and what he thought of the president.
Mr. President, what will cure a depression?
Confidence! And lick this old depression. Confidence! And wear the right expression. Smile, grin, laugh right out loud, and watch the golden sunshine scatter every cloud. Confidence! Hey, hey! It's our salvation. Confidence! The hope of our great nation. Teach it, preach it, count it, shout it. Confidence! Just have confidence.
The poor guy who got knocked over twice was Cactus Jack Garner. Jack Gardner, former Speaker of the House and Roosevelt's vice president for his first two terms. Vice presidents didn't get any respect back then either. Thank you. I enjoyed making the presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Happy to answer any questions that might be out there.
All right, thanks a lot, Heath. really nice find on the material in the Copyright Office. There's a number of artists and engravers with connections to the mint that have entries in the Copyright Office listings. I recall that you produced either an article or a book on this subject. Can you remind the attendees what that was?
Not an article yet. I have threatened to write one at this point. There was an earlier version of this PowerPoint that I did for Metal Collectors of America and some other groups that have updated for today. So I think that's probably what we did. I think I must, having done this, now put together an article describing these metals and listing them so that people have a readier reference than the PowerPoint. Okay. I think the PowerPoint's in the portal, by the way.
Yeah, I believe it is. So if anyone wants to enter Q&A, you can do that through the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen. If you don't see it, just hover your mouse over that area and it will appear. I'll just give a minute for any questions here.
Tough slot late on a Saturday. I imagine people are tired.
Yeah, Saturday night seems to be the one time of the week when people don't feel compelled to send a lot of email, so which is actually nice. All right, I think that'll wrap it up. So Heath, thanks again for presenting. Video will be available via NNP in 2 or 3 weeks down the line.
Correct. Thanks, Len.
All right, thanks, Heath.